She walked into court with the quiet confidence of a teenager who truly believed she was going home. 16 years old, steady steps, a calm face, the kind of calm that made the judge look at her twice. But before that moment, Sarah Johnson was the girl everyone in Bellevue thought they knew. Sports photos on the wall, family dinners, a life that looked ordinary in every way. Inside the Johnson home, mornings were simple. Diane pouring coffee, Alan stepping into his shower, the porch lights still glowing as the town slowly woke up. A house on a quiet street, the kind people trust without thinking twice. Homes like this aren't supposed to hold secrets. But on that September morning, police cars rolled in. Neighbors stepped outside in confusion, and the silence in front of the Johnson home felt wrong. And in the middle of it stood Sarah, calm, steady, almost untouched by the chaos around her. Something in her tone didn't match the fear rising in the neighborhood, and detectives felt it instantly. This wasn't a crime scene they walked into. It was a puzzle a child had tried to solve alone. The air in Bellevue, Idaho carried that familiar early morning chill on September 2nd, 2003. But inside the Johnson home, something felt unnaturally still. Detectives stepped into the master bedroom first, and the scene stopped them in their tracks. Diane Johnson lay on her side in bed, positioned as if she were still sleeping, with no sign of a struggle. Across the house, a shower was still running, water hitting the tub like a steady drumbeat. Alan Scott Johnson was found collapsed in that shower, the steam mixing with the cold reality settling over the room. One coffee cup sat on the kitchen counter, still warm when officers touched it, and that detail lingered in the mind of every investigator who walked through that door. A house that should have held noise, footsteps, and familiar morning routines instead felt like a place frozen mid-sentence. Outside, Sarah Johnson sat on her neighbor's steps, wrapped in a jacket she didn't seem to need. Detectives later said she didn't look shaken, and that observation became one of the earliest notes in the case file. Neighbor Kim Richards testified that Sarah approached her calmly and said, "I think someone shot my parents." Her voice was low, almost steady, not the voice of someone who stumbled into tragedy moments earlier. Richards remembered placing a hand on Sarah's back and feeling no trembling, just stillness, a stillness that stood out in a morning full of fear. Officers who approached her also noticed her composure. No hyperventilating, no frantic questions, no desperate requests to see her mother or father. It was the first sign detectives could not ignore. As officers moved through the house, everything felt too quiet. They documented footprints on the lawn outside the guest house, noted the path between the small structure and the main home, and logged the items inside Alan's shower caddy. The rifle used in the killings, a .264 caliber Winchester Model 70, belonged to the Johnson family and was kept in the guest house where Alan stored hunting gear. It was an important detail because it meant whoever committed this crime already knew exactly where that rifle was kept. When detectives asked Sarah if she heard anything unusual that morning, she said she heard 2 loud bangs, then paused and added, "Actually, maybe one. I'm not sure." Officers found that uncertainty odd for such a traumatic moment. She went on to say she ran outside immediately because she thought someone was outside the house. Her words were soft, her eyes stayed dry, and the more she spoke, the more detectives noticed how rehearsed her tone sounded. Hours later, the investigation took a sharp turn. A neighbor across the street called police after noticing a black trash bag inside their bin that didn't belong there. Officers recovered the bag before the garbage truck made its full round. Inside, they found a pink bathrobe saturated with Diane Johnson's blood, a left-hand leather glove, and a right-hand latex glove. Gunshot residue was detected on the leather glove. The latex glove had biological traces that later matched Sarah. A family robe, a pair of mismatched gloves, items thrown away in a neighbor's trash bin. It was the moment investigators realized the truth wasn't hiding far away. It wasn't connected to a break-in. It wasn't tied to a stranger. The answer was right next door, and it was about to become unavoidable. When detectives questioned Sarah again, they asked whether she recognized the robe. She responded, "I wore it when I was younger. I used latex gloves for cleaning." Detective Harkins later testified that when he mentioned the robe being found covered in her mother's blood, her face didn't shift. She didn't gasp. She didn't break down. She just stayed quiet. Investigators left that interview with more questions than answers, but one thing stood out clearly. Her calmness didn't feel like shock. It felt like someone trying to stay consistent. As the day stretched on, the sun hit the Johnson driveway, warming the pavement where officers had been walking for hours. Friends and classmates who heard the news said they expected Sarah to collapse in grief or cling to the adults around her. Instead, she asked one friend whether school volleyball practice would still happen later that week. That comment spread quickly among neighbors because it didn't match the gravity of the morning. It created a ripple of confusion, the kind that whispers through a small community when something feels off, but no one wants to admit it yet. Investigators continued stitching together the timeline. At around 6:20 a.m., a neighbor heard two sharp sounds, one louder than the other. The shower running, Diane still in bed, and the position of both. Bodies indicated the killings were carried out quickly and in a narrow window of time. Nothing in the house showed forced entry. Nothing suggested a robbery. The killer moved through the home without rushing, knowing exactly where to go. For law enforcement, that fact alone ruled out most outside suspects. Detectives then examined the lawn surrounding the guest house. They noted impressions in the grass leading directly to the side door of the main house. The distance between the guest house and the master bedroom matched the speed of someone carrying a rifle in the early morning light. Every detail pointed toward a controlled walk, not a frantic run. And that walk told detectives the shooter wasn't afraid of being seen. In the late afternoon, officers reviewed Sarah's timeline again. She said she woke up, heard a sound, stepped outside, saw nothing, and ran to the neighbor's home. But her statements shifted slightly each time she repeated them. When asked whether she checked on her parents, she insisted she didn't go into their bedroom because she was too scared. That answer didn't align with most children's natural instinct to seek their parents first when afraid. It bothered investigators deeply. By evening, the evidence gathered filled multiple bags: the robe, the gloves, stray hairs, the rifle trace, footprints, and early DNA samples. And as detectives drove the recovered trash bin to the forensic lab, one wrote in his report, "If she didn't do this, then why were the gloves and robe hidden in a neighbor's garbage?" That question became the turning point of the case. Night settled over Bellevue, casting long shadows over the Johnson home. Patrol cars remained posted outside as the quiet neighborhood processed what they had witnessed. A family taken, a teenager calm enough to unsettle those trying to help her, and a trail of evidence that seemed to speak louder than any words that came out of her mouth. The DNA test hadn't come back yet, but investigators already knew whose fingerprints were all over this story. When investigators returned to the Johnson property hours after the initial response, their attention shifted to the small guest house behind the main home, a place Alan Johnson treated as his retreat for hunting gear and tools. Inside a narrow closet leaned the family's .264 caliber Winchester Model 70, the rifle that had fired both fatal shots that morning, and the discovery set a new tone in the investigation because this was not a weapon a stranger would know how to access. The guest house door showed no forced entry, yet the key to it was found resting on a side table inside Sarah's bedroom, a detail the lead detective later described as too tidy to be chance in court testimony. Gun residue collected from the leather glove found in the neighbor's trash matched the type of ammunition fired from that rifle, and patterns of blood on Diane's bedsheets were consistent with the close range of a shooter standing exactly where the muzzle of that rifle would reach. When detectives brought the rifle out for processing, one of them whispered in his report, "Someone in this house knew exactly where it was and how to fire it." The weapon wasn't the only clue. It was the start of a trail that now pointed inward. 2 days later, the forensic unit contacted Bellevue detectives with the first round of DNA results from the items recovered in the neighbor's trash bin. The latex glove, the one turned slightly inside out, carried Sarah's DNA on the inner finger linings, the kind of placement that indicated she had worn it for more than a few seconds. On the exterior of that same glove were particles of gun residue matching the rifle from the guest house. The bathrobe recovered with the gloves held a mixture of Diane's blood and Sarah's genetic profile, and the blood spatter on the inner collar showed the robe had been only inches away from Diane at the moment of the gunshot. Analysts also found a single strand of Sarah's hair trapped in the robe's inner seam, a detail the prosecutor later referenced when he said, "A tiny strand of hair can speak louder than any courtroom testimony," and in this case it did. Each result tightened the timeline, narrowed the suspect list, and made the investigators lean in closer to what they had been sensing since the morning began. Beyond the science, detectives needed to understand the emotional landscape inside the Johnson home, and that brought them to the heart of the motive they were slowly uncovering: Sarah's relationship with 19-year-old Bruno Santos. According to sworn testimony, the relationship had been a point of tension for months because Alan and Diane believed Bruno, who had a minor criminal history, was too old and too influential on their daughter. Court records documented that Alan confronted Bruno and told him he was a waste and that he did not want her seeing him, a statement Bruno admitted during interviews and said hurt, but I understood he was her dad. Neighbors recalled overhearing heated discussions between Sarah and her parents during Labor Day weekend in 2003, particularly after the Johnsons discovered Sarah had spent the night at Bruno's apartment. Prosecutor Jim Thomas later stated in open court that the Johnsons were preparing to file charges of statutory rape if the relationship continued, a point that investigators described as the spark that made everything feel urgent for her. The more detectives learned about that escalating conflict, the more clearly the emotional motive rose to the surface. The timeline after the murders added even more weight to the growing suspicion. While detectives were still marking evidence, measuring distances, and examining the guest house, Sarah's behavior stood apart from what most children exhibit in the wake of losing both parents. Officers noted that she asked about her volleyball practice scheduled for later in the week and arranged a nail appointment that same afternoon, behavior several friends described as oddly normal. One friend told investigators that Sarah said, "Please find Bruno and tell him I love him no matter what happens," a statement included in police logs and later read aloud during trial. Grief carries many forms, but her behavior lacked the disorientation or emotional collapse detectives expected, and instead reflected someone trying to maintain a routine unaffected by the tragedy inside her home. The detectives assigned to the case exchanged glances each time she spoke, noticing her voice remained steady even when discussing the deaths of her parents. As the evidence mounted, investigators reconstructed the shooter's movements with increasing precision. The first shot was estimated at around 6:20 a.m., consistent with statements from a neighbor who heard what she described as a loud pop, followed by another sound moments later. The guest house door, the route across the lawn, and the entry into the main home aligned with the sequence of events pieced together from footprints found in dew-covered grass. The robe recovered from the trash, according to court documents, appeared to have been worn backward to shield clothing from blood, a method investigators had observed in previous homicide cases. Gun residue found on the leather glove matched residue on the rifle stock, tying the items together in a way that left little room for coincidence. By the time the forensic reconstruction was complete, every path of evidence, physical, emotional, and behavioral, formed a line directing detectives toward one person. Yet even with that clarity growing, investigators worked methodically, checking each step, ensuring the facts stood firm. They compared call logs, confirmed the timeline with neighbors, noted the absence of forced entry, and tested the remaining firearms in the home for potential involvement. The analysis of the bullet trajectory in the master bedroom placed the shooter at a specific angle, one that matched the height and reach of a small-framed person, a detail noted carefully in the forensic report submitted to the county court. Every detail supported the emerging conclusion that this crime was not spontaneous or chaotic, but carried traces of someone who moved with intention. As the evening settled on Bellevue and the streets grew quiet, detectives sat in the briefing room reviewing the assembled evidence. On the table before them lay photographs of the guest house rifle, the DNA charts, the robe, the gloves, and the footprint impressions leading away from the home. One detective closed his folder and said, "We thought we were dealing with a terrible loss, but this isn't just loss. This is direction." Another added, "You don't gather items like this unless you're thinking ahead." The room fell silent as the weight of the assembled facts pressed inward, reshaping the case from a tragedy into something far more deliberate. Detectives thought they were investigating a tragedy, but the evidence told them they were investigating a plan. And as they prepared for the next morning's round of questioning, one truth settled over the case like a shadow. The person they needed answers from was the person who had been calmest from the beginning. Investigators returned to the station on September 4th, 2003, carrying binders full of evidence that pointed in one direction, and they knew it was time to speak with Sarah again. They invited her into an interview room, a small space meant for simple conversations, not the kind that ended childhoods, and laid out each item with deliberate clarity. The latex glove was placed in front of her first, followed by the leather glove, and then the bathrobe still sealed in a transparent bag, its fabric stained with unmistakable traces of the morning she claimed she knew nothing about. Detective Harkins explained calmly that laboratory analysis had matched her DNA to the inside of the glove, and he told her, "Sarah, only one person's prints were on the robe, and they belong to you." She held her gaze steady, lifted her chin slightly, and said in a soft voice, "I didn't kill my parents." With the same controlled calmness she had displayed since the day detectives arrived at her home. The denial didn't shake, not even when confronted with science that didn't bend. The conversation continued with the same unexpected stillness, but investigators noticed small details that didn't match the seriousness of the moment, like the way her fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the table and the way she occasionally looked toward the closed door as if expecting someone to walk through and take her home. They repeated their findings: her hair inside the robe's seam, her mother's blood on the fabric, gun residue on the gloves, and footprints matching her path from the guest house to the main home. Instead of breaking, Sarah simply said, "Someone is framing me," and the tone of her voice remained consistent, measured, almost rehearsed. But then investigators brought up something that had nothing to do with DNA and everything to do with motive, and the conversation shifted like the air inside the room had changed temperature. When the lead detective said, "We need to talk about Bruno," the composure that had carried her through 2 days of questioning suddenly tightened around her words. Detectives documented that Sarah's voice grew firmer, her breathing changed, and she asked, "What does he have to do with this?" in a tone sharper than anything she had shown earlier. They explained that witnesses had confirmed arguments between her and her parents over Bruno, including the Labor Day incident where Diane and Alan confronted her for spending the night at his apartment without permission. They reminded her of the statement she made to a friend, "Tell Bruno I love him no matter what happens," a line that spread through the investigation like a thread pulling two worlds together. Prosecutor Jim Thomas had already informed detectives that the Johnsons planned to report Bruno for statutory rape, a fact that directly threatened the relationship Sarah believed was her escape. Her reaction to Bruno's name became the first crack in her mask, and detectives recognized it instantly, because emotions tell a truth no glove test can replicate. Within hours, the evidence was assembled into a timeline clear enough for authorities to take the next step, and officers drove to the Johnson home to bring Sarah into custody. 16 years old, standing at the doorway of the family house she once described as safe. She barely flinched when an officer said, "Sarah, you're under arrest for the murders of Alan and Diane Johnson." According to the arrest record, she stood still, nodded once, and placed her hands behind her back without hesitation, her expression steady in a way that made even seasoned officers question whether she understood the gravity of the moment or believed she could talk her way through it. The hallway was quiet, except for the clicking of handcuffs, and as she stepped outside, the weight of the town's disbelief seemed to linger in the air around her. 16 years old, but walking with the stillness of someone who believed she was untouchable. News spread through Bellevue faster than detectives expected, and the town split into two emotional camps almost immediately. Some of Sarah's classmates refused to believe she had anything to do with the deaths and said she was sweet, soft-spoken, and would never hurt anyone, repeating the words they had told reporters and investigators during the early interviews. Others whispered that they sensed something was wrong the morning she stood outside her house without tears, without shaking hands, and without the confusion most people felt in the face of sudden, unimaginable loss. Parents in the community debated the case with growing tension, wondering how a conflict between a teenager and her parents could lead to 2 funerals and a murder charge. For a town known for quiet streets, familiar neighbors, and slow mornings, the idea that the suspect was not a stranger, but the daughter of the victims, left an imprint that no press conference could ease. The emotional blow reached her circle of friends as well. Some insisted she was incapable of violence and recalled memories of school dances, volleyball practices, and weekends spent laughing at local diners. Others told detectives that Sarah had grown distant in the months leading up to the murders, shifting her focus toward Bruno and making statements that concerned them, including telling one friend, "My parents always try to control my life." The town tried to make sense of it, but no matter how they arranged the pieces, nothing fit the version of Sarah they thought they knew. Each day the divide grew deeper, with some clinging to the hope that the evidence was a misunderstanding, and others believing the calmness she showed was not innocence, but the quiet of someone who believed she had already gotten away with something irreversible. Detectives, meanwhile, prepared the final evidence summary to hand to prosecutors, assembling the scientific findings, the interviews, the behavioral inconsistencies, and the emotional triggers that tied the entire case together. They reviewed every detail, every quote, every timeline discrepancy, and every piece of physical evidence that traced back to Sarah's hands. And as they sent the final file forward, the question that hung in the air was the same one that echoed throughout Bellevue, through her school, through her extended family, and through every person who learned the truth behind the Johnson murders. Everyone asked the same question. Why would a child choose a boy over the people who gave her life? The trial of Sarah Marie Johnson began in February 2005, and from the moment she stepped into the Blaine County courtroom, people noticed the confidence she carried with her. She walked with her shoulders straight and her gaze steady, almost as if she believed every accusation made against her was nothing more than a misunderstanding that would disappear once she explained her side. Her defense team leaned heavily into that image, telling jurors that Sarah was a scared, confused 16-year-old caught in the middle of a terrible tragedy, a phrase echoed multiple times during opening statements. They argued that investigators rushed to judgment, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that Sarah's calm behavior in the days after the murders was shock, not intention. The prosecution, however, arrived prepared to map out a forensic timeline that would challenge every piece of that narrative, and from the first hour, the energy inside the courtroom shifted toward tension that grew thicker with each new detail. Jurors leaned forward, knowing they were about to hear the science behind a crime that had fractured an entire community. The state walked the jury through the morning of September 2nd with meticulous clarity, beginning with the reconstructed path from the guest house to the Johnson bedroom, and then to the shower where Alan was found. Prosecutor Jim Thomas lifted the transparent evidence bag containing the latex glove and said, "This item was found with the defendant's DNA inside the finger linings and gun residue on the outside. There is no innocent explanation for that." The courtroom remained quiet as he displayed the bathrobe, explaining that Diane's blood and Sarah's DNA intertwined on the fabric in a pattern consistent with proximity to the gunshot. When the rifle case was introduced, an Idaho State Police forensic analyst testified, "We recovered the defendant's fingerprints on the interior of the case," a statement later cited in multiple news reports covering the trial. As each piece of evidence was placed into context, the timeline prosecutors built became increasingly difficult for the defense to dismantle. It wasn't just objects, it was a sequence of movements, choices, and physical traces that held the weight of truth. Then came the evidence that cut through every illusion the defense attempted to maintain. Jurors saw enlarged photographs of the gloves and the robe, the garments that investigators found discarded in a neighbor's trash bin the morning of the murders. They listened as experts explained the gun residue patterns on the leather glove, which matched residue recovered from the rifle stock used to kill Alan and Diane. A forensic scientist told the court, "Gun residue does not appear without contact," grounding the science in language every juror could understand. Another critical moment landed when prosecutors revealed Sarah's fingerprints on the inside of the rifle case, directly tying her to the weapon that had ended her parents' lives. Even Sarah's expression shifted slightly when the analyst stated, "The probability of these prints belonging to someone other than the defendant is mathematically insignificant." With each line of testimony, the prosecution dismantled the argument that the evidence was circumstantial, because the physical proof did not suggest possibility. It showed certainty. But the trial wasn't only about science. It was also about the emotional current running through the Johnson family in the months leading up to the killings. Friends of Sarah took the stand and described arguments between her and her parents, recalling moments where Diane tried to establish boundaries, and Alan expressed worry over her relationship with 19-year-old Bruno Santos. One friend testified that Sarah once said, "They don't understand me, and they won't let me live my life," a statement documented in the trial transcript and repeated during closing arguments. Another friend recounted how Sarah seemed increasingly defiant as her parents tightened rules around her privileges, grounding her multiple times in the summer of 2003. The defense argued these were normal teenage frustrations, not indicators of violence, but the testimonies carried weight when placed beside the pressure building around the relationship with Bruno. Sometimes the truth we know is the truth we refuse to accept. The emotional weight of those testimonies settled across the courtroom like a slow realization. A family had been crumbling before tragedy struck, and the warning signs were clearer in hindsight. When the trial reached its final days, the prosecution's closing argument tied every thread together with unflinching precision. They asked jurors to consider the consistency of the evidence, the proximity of the items found, the timing of the shots, and the lack of forced entry. They reminded them that the person who killed Diane and Alan moved confidently inside a home they knew well. The defense, standing in contrast, urged the jury to see a scared teenager wrongly targeted by detectives who misunderstood her behavior and misinterpreted the evidence. But as the judge instructed the jury, and the courtroom fell into a hush, it became clear that the weight of facts had built a foundation too solid to ignore. After hours of deliberation, jurors returned with a verdict that would echo through Idaho for years. On March 16, 2005, the four-person stood, holding the verdict form with steady hands, and when the judge asked for the decision, the answer delivered was firm. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Sarah Marie Johnson, guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Diane Johnson and guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Alan Johnson." The courtroom remained still, waiting for any emotional reaction from Sarah, but she didn't cry, didn't shake, and didn't ask why. She simply lowered her head and blinked slowly, as if the moment she believed would send her home had turned into something she never imagined. Even the judge noted her composure during sentencing, later stating in records that her lack of visible remorse was striking. That silence carried its own weight, heavier than any spoken word. She walked into court certain she would go home. But the judge had other plans. When Sarah returned to the courtroom for sentencing on June 30th, 2005, the energy inside the room felt heavier than anything that had unfolded during the trial, because this was the moment where the consequences of every decision made inside that home would be carved into law. She sat at the defense table in a light-colored sweater, her hands folded neatly, and her expression unchanged from the day the verdict was read, as if she had trained herself to believe that silence was strength. Judge Barry Wood delivered the sentence carefully and without hesitation, stating that the murders of Diane and Alan Johnson were planned, deliberate, and carried out in a manner that showed an understanding of the finality of death. A line recorded in the court transcript and later quoted by multiple Idaho newspapers. He sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole for each count, to run consecutively, and added a firearm enhancement of 15 years. As he addressed her directly, he said, "You chose a path that ended 2 lives and forever altered your own." And those words lingered in the air long after he stopped speaking. The sentence marked the end of a trial, but only the beginning of a lifetime of reflection for everyone touched by the case. The years that followed brought a series of appeals filed on Sarah's behalf, each one raising questions about whether a teenager could fully understand the weight of her actions and whether a life without parole sentence for a juvenile met constitutional standards after the Supreme Court's rulings on youth sentencing. Her legal team filed for post-conviction relief, arguing that her age, emotional development, and the influence of her relationship with Bruno should have been given greater consideration. In one appeal filing, her attorneys wrote, "Sarah was a child acting under pressures she could not navigate alone," claiming ineffective counsel and improper forensic handling. The courts reviewed each petition in detail, examining the trial record, the expert testimony, and the evidence that had anchored the original conviction. But every appellate court that reviewed her case, including the Idaho Court of Appeals and the U.S. Ninth Circuit, ultimately denied her requests, with one ruling stating, "The defendant has not demonstrated that the original sentence was unconstitutional or imposed in error," a line that reaffirmed the severity of the original verdict. With each denial, the possibility of freedom grew more distant, and the reality of a life spent behind prison walls became permanent. Outside the legal documents and courtroom discussions, the weight of this case settled heavily on those left behind. Bellevue, a town known for quiet neighborhoods and familiar faces, struggled to accept that the Johnson home, once seen as a place of safety, had become the center of a tragedy carried out from within. Friends of Diane and Alan grieved the loss of two steady, hard-working parents who had built a peaceful life, and their extended family mourned in a way that felt doubled, because they lost not only two loved ones, but also the daughter who took them. One relative said in a televised interview, "We lost 3 people that day," capturing the emotional complication of loving a child whose actions you cannot defend. Community members tried to heal by showing up for memorials, sharing stories about the Johnsons' kindness, and keeping their memory alive in small ways, through flowers left at the church altar, through quiet conversations at local gatherings, and through the reflections that surfaced every September. Healing took time, and even years later, the silence around the subject was often louder than any discussion. The case reached far beyond Idaho, becoming a national reference for multiple areas of criminal justice, especially in debates surrounding juveniles sentenced to life without parole. Legal scholars use the Johnson case in academic discussions when evaluating how courts should weigh adolescent psychology and emotional development during sentencing. Advocacy groups reference the case in arguments both for and against reform, with some stating that the level of planning shown in Sarah's actions demonstrated that certain juvenile offenders possess adult-level intent. In psychological circles, the case became an example of how family conflict, emotional attachment, and rebellion can escalate in rare but devastating ways. Forensic experts cited the investigation as a model for how physical evidence in domestic homicide cases, especially involving juveniles, can provide clarity when emotional testimonies conflict. Over time, the Johnson case became one of those stories referenced not because of its shock alone, but because it raised questions about accountability, choice, and the complexities of adolescent decision-making in ways that continue to shape professional conversations today. As the documentary reaches the end of this story, the emotional impact does not rest solely in the details of the crime or the courtroom exchanges. It rests in what remains when the dust settles. 2 lives were taken inside a home where mornings once began with the smell of coffee and quiet conversations, and the person responsible was someone those parents trusted without question. This wasn't just the story of a crime. It was the story of a home silenced by someone it trusted. For those who knew Diane and Alan, justice came through the facts presented in court. But the grief carried by their family and community became a reminder of how quickly the foundations of a household can fracture. Their legacy endures not through the tragedy, but through the memories held by those who loved them. Memories that deserve to be spoken aloud so they are never forgotten. If this story moved you, share their names, because memory is its own kind of justice.